going to be talking about the past, present and future of speculative zoology. And let's see how it turns out. So, thanks to our discovery of evolution and of geological time, we understand that modern animals represent the endpoints of a lengthy past. But our discovery of evolution and of geological time also shows us that animals have a future in which further evolutionary change is expected to occur. People have, of course, always speculated about the future, so it shouldn't be surprising to find that a rich literature exists in which people have wondered about the kinds of animals that might inhabit the Earth in future times. Our understanding that history is shaped by unpredictable events, that it owes its shape to contingency, not destiny, means that the idea of alternative timelines has become increasingly popular. Variously termed alternative history, AH, allied history, or Uchronia, there is in fact a whole genre of fiction describing the events of alternative timelines, and the alternative timeline concept is mainstream due to its appearance in franchises like Star Trek and Back to the Future, and Family Guy as well, I suppose. In scientific writing, Stephen Jay Gould's book Wonderful Life emphasised the point that evolutionary events weren't destined to occur in the way that they did. What if the major extinction events hadn't happened? What if key climatic or geographical events had played out differently? Well, these kinds of questions have now been considered by many people interested in evolution, meaning that there are numerous alternative timeline animals. And together, these two areas, speculations about future animals, speculations about alternative timeline animals, they belong to the branch of speculative evolution termed speculative zoology. And in this talk, I really want to remain focused on speculative zoology. This gives me a good excuse to avoid talking about other kinds of organisms like plants. Also means that I don't have to discuss aliens, although having said that, a large number of fictional aliens clearly are animals or animal-like organisms, meaning that there is a substantial amount of overlap between fictional aliens and imaginary Earth creatures. Furthermore, there's an enormous number of imaginary animals that are neither from the future, nor obviously from alternative timelines, nor are they aliens, but they clearly are speculative. And in the end, it's futile to try and neatly segregate these different topics. They all overlap extensively in extremely messy fashion. I would say that perhaps first, with respect to the invention of future or alternative timeline animals, was H.G. Wells. He remained supremely influential in creating possible future humans and far future non-human animals. This, of course, was for his 1895 novella, The Time Machine. The many works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, published between 1912 and the early 1960s, these also overlap with the speculative zoology remit. We have the alien creatures of Barsoom, the Hollow Earth stories of Pellucidar, also stories that tell of the survival of prehistoric animals to modern times, for example, in the Land That Time Forgot, which was first published in 1918. Together, Wells and Burroughs form, I think, a sort of foundational bedrock for essentially everything that followed. Let's now jump forward to the 1950s, because in 1957, an extremely interesting book was published in Germany titled Bauernleben der Rhinoceros, supposedly published by biologist Harald Stumpka. It was translated into English in 1967 as The Snouters, Form and Life of the Rhinogrades. And this book describes the diversity, anatomy, behaviour and evolutionary relationships of the 189 species of snouters or rhinogrades, a group of shrew-like mammals that exhibit unparalleled diversity with respect to the anatomy of their noses and some other bits of their anatomy. Sad to say, the snouters are actually fictional, and the book has sometimes been seen as like a hoax or a giant practical joke, but I think it's more reasonably seen as an exercise in speculative zoology, given that so much thought and effort went into the crafting of snouter biology and evolution. The late 1970s and early 1980s was a real boom time, as goes ideas, interest in speculative zoology. It's a really interesting question as to why that was. Peter Dickinson's book of 1979, The Flight of Dragons, this deserves, I think, special mention because it did a good job of showing how a group of imaginary entities can be imagined as semi-plausible biological entities with an evolutionary past. The dragons of Dickinson's book, they are the descendants of Tyrannosaurus-like theropods. that survived the end Cretaceous extinction event by taking to the air. The book describes dragon anatomy, biology, functional morphology, and behaviour. More famously, 1981 saw the publication of Dougal Dixon's After Man. And this book is, a real benchmark for speculative zoology, by far the most influential work on the subject. So we see a world 50 million years in the future. Humans, of course, are entirely extinct. And we are introduced to something like 110 future animals that inhabit all major environments on all major land masses. Giant rodents, rabbits, marsupials, mongooses and primates dominate the majority of terrestrial faunas. Giant penguins have taken the place of whales and dolphins. And the Pacific island archipelago Batavia is inhabited by a spectacular array of big flightless bats, most notably the hypercarnivorous night stalker, which you can see at bottom right there. The influence and significance of After Man can't be emphasised enough. It spawned a Japanese TV series. It made Dougal Dixon the primary go-to guy for speculative zoology, and it's really hard to find speculative zoology projects since 1981 that weren't inspired by After Man or aren't in some way based on After Man. And we'll see more Dougal Dixon projects in a moment. Moving on, though, 1982 saw the creation of Dale Russell's Dinosauroid. Inspired by the relatively large brain in the Cretaceous theropod Troodon, known at the time as Styracosaurus or Stenomycosaurus, Russell wondered what might have happened if Troodon-type dinosaurs hadn't become extinct, but if they continued evolving towards the present. And as anyone who's ever opened the 1980s dinosaur book will know, Russell's proposal was that the brain size in these dinosaurs would have increased to human-like proportions, and this would have caused a series of anatomical and postural changes, the inevitable end result of which would have been humanoid dinosaurs. I don't think Russell's scenario is likely at all. There's a whole load of problems with it. One of the main problems is there's actually no good reason for thinking that the evolution of like a large human-sized brain is correlated with the evolution of a humanoid body shape. But his idea has inspired numerous other people to invent big-brained alternative timeline dinosaurs of their own, and pretty much all of those, I would say, are more, realistic than his was. Dinosaurs also form the focus of Dougal Dixon's next major project, this being The New Dinosaurs, published in 1988. We see an alternative timeline Earth, where the end Cretaceous extinction event didn't happen. Non-avian dinosaurs still dominate the land, and a number of other Mesozoic style groups are really important as well, most notably pterosaurs and plesiosaurs. The furry coated theropods and quadrupedal striding pterosaurs of the new dinosaurs, they don't look as ridiculous now as they did back in 1988. In fact, in many respects, they can be considered pretty prophetic. Some of the other creatures in the book, however, they're somewhat more surreal and are unlikely to have evolved from the ostensible ancestors that he favoured. There's then, also by Dougal Dixon, Man After Man, published in 1990, and this discusses the possible evolution of humanity into the future. We see a large number of...
Sorry, excuse me, you want a mic or something, did you?
Right now, we're okay, thanks.
You okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you. Man After Man, we see, it's full of really freaky, surreal creatures. A lot of people find it quite disturbing. A possible future for Homo sapiens and a set of descendant species. And 1990 also saw the publication of Wayne Barlow's book, Expedition. I said I wouldn't talk about aliens, but can't not mention this. It describes how a 24th century team of human scientists visit Darwin 4, and they discover a whole suite of spectacular alien creatures, many of which really are alien compared to preceding aliens and other speculative creatures. Now, quite an important event in the world of speculative zoology happened in 2004. An entire TV series devoted entirely to speculative zoology appeared, titled The Future is Wild. And it involved the ideas and expertise of a whole panel of biologists, climatologists, paleontologists. Again, Dougal Dixon was extensively involved. Again, we have a pretty impressive pantheon of possible future animals. We see the Earth at three successively more distant phases in the future. First in an ice age where mammals and birds are important. Then in a hothouse phase, a time of high sea levels, giant tortoises have evolved. Big arthropods are increasingly important, mammals have declined. And finally, in a far future super arid phase, where gigantic mollusks and huge predatory slime molds dominate the land, fish inhabit the skies. And since then, since 2004, and yeah, I said flish. Since 2004, you could argue that speculative zoology has become increasingly mainstream. The TV series Primeval, which ran from 2007 to 2011, this often featured creatures from alternative or future timelines, most notably the imaginatively named future predator, a giant predatory flightless bat from the future, you know, kind of animal that sounds somewhat familiar by now. The 2011 TV series Terra Nova, this is set in Cretaceous times, but on a parallel timeline Earth, and we see like a few animals, most notably the fictional theropod called the Slasher. During 2012 and 2013, the Discovery Channel broadcast its two docufictions or documentaries, whatever you want to call them, these two TV shows on mermaids. Now, most intelligent people who have expressed an opinion hated the mermaids TV shows, predominantly for the reason that they masqueraded as genuine documentaries, and they thereby fooled a significant percentage of the viewing public who honestly thought they were seeing real documentaries about the discovery of real-life mermaids. And seen within that context, you know, they're pretty deplorable and exploitative bits of divisive television. However, they did involve the invention of like an alternative evolutionary scenario. They involved the creation of alternative timeline speculative animals, and seen within that context, you know, they could be seen as successful, mainstream, lucrative, speculative zoology projects, although I'm not in any way endorsing the quality or integrity of these documentaries. They're pretty terrible. And finally, in 2013, talking of things that are pretty terrible, the M. Night Shyamalan movie After Earth, this features hypothetical future animals as major cast members. Now, there are, of course, numerous other TV shows, movies, and books and so on that I could have mentioned in the review I've just given. Plus, there are the numerous internet-based speculative zoology projects. You appreciate I just don't have time to cover everything today. Now, there are good reasons for thinking that speculative zoology of a sort, the invention of imaginary animals, monster building, there are good reasons for thinking that this is an ancient endeavour. That people have been inventing creatures for as long as they've been documenting their ideas through artwork and literature, because we know of ancient rock art which seemingly depicts wholly fictional animals. At top left, we've got some weird nondescript monsters from Paleolithic Europe. At top right, we've got some sort of mermaid-style creatures illustrated by the San people of Southern Africa. And at bottom, we've got two of the various weird horned, sometimes winged, sometimes spiky-backed monsters, like the piazza bird and the underwater panther. These come from various North American cultures. Then there are those creatures that, they might have their origins in stories of genuine animals. They are predominantly fictional. They've been invented to fill allegorical roles in stories. They've been invented to appear on maps or banners or flags or whatever. So I'm talking about things like giants, griffins, dragons, the sea monsters that you see on old maps. Those kind of creatures, they represent creatures of this sort. Now, there are all kinds of reasons as to why people have always indulged in monster building. Some of the creatures I've just mentioned are meant to be from different spiritual planes. Some of them, as I've already said, some of them were meant to be allegories or symbols, and some of them really were invented for decoration or to inspire fear or act as warnings. But these kinds of creatures, they weren't invented with a biological or evolutionary backstory in mind, so I don't think they should be seen as part of speculative zoology. However, the key interest lies in the fact that they established the antiquity of monster building within our species. We have pretty much been doing this for as long as we've existed. And monster building is, I think, almost certainly ancestral to another major area of another major intellectual endeavour, and an area that I think certainly does overlap with speculative zoology. I'm referring to the fact that a large number of supposedly real animals supposedly exist. They've been given their own distinct evolutionary histories, their own distinct zoological identities, their own precise ecological and behavioural characteristics. I am, of course, referring to the cryptids of the cryptozoological literature. We tend to think of cryptids like Sasquatch and Loch Ness Monster. We tend to think of them as identikit-style creatures that have been pieced together through the accumulation of numerous different bits of anecdotal data. And that's partly true, but equally or more important is the fact that some cryptids have been proposed with a specific biological identity and a specific evolutionary backstory in mind. In other words, they've been created in much the same way as have the creatures unambiguously associated with speculative zoology. So to take one particularly famous example, it has been suggested that the Loch Ness Monster is a long-necked plesiosaur which has survived from the end of the Cretaceous to the present. It's been suggested that because it lives in a really cold lake in Scotland, then presumably it's got an elevated metabolism of some kind. It's been suggested that it has inflatable humps on its back, erectile snorkels on its head, and that it's protected by some sort of like insulatory fat layer or maybe even a furry pelt. And it's been given a technical scientific binomial name, Nessoteris rhombopteryx, which was published in the journal Nature. Now, this is a very specific set of hypotheses which involves precise predictions about the alleged creature's appearance, biology, and evolutionary history. And some or most of these ideas are more to do with circumventing the problems of the alleged creature's proposed identity, you know, this being that it's a long-necked, modern-day plesiosaur that lives in a cold lake in Scotland. These hypotheses are more to do with that identity than they are with data from eyewitness accounts. So in other words, the construction of this version of the Loch Ness Monster is more of an exercise in speculative zoology than an interpretation of eyewitness data. And there are numerous other examples of this kind of thing in the cryptozoological literature, and this in fact is the topic that John Memo Kozman and myself explored in our 2013 book, The Cryptozoologicon, which I believe you can buy.
In the lobby.
Moving on, there's an entirely different set of creatures that have been invented for wholly different reasons, and this time it's to fill gaps in our knowledge about the past. I didn't want to use the term missing link, but it basically is the best term for these things. So, there are numerous gaps in the fossil record that leave us guessing as to the specifics of certain evolutionary transitions. And obviously the more fossils we find, the more these gaps get filled, but even today, you know, a whole bunch of them remain. There are loads of these gaps in the fossil record. To take one of the most classic examples, there must at some stage have been mammals that were intermediate between the earliest known bats and the nearest non-bat relatives of bats, whatever kinds of mammals they were. We can call these unknown bat ancestors Proto Bats, and they remain unknown from the fossil record. So people interested in bat evolution have proposed their own hypothetical Proto Bats, their own ideas, visualizations of what this, you know, these bat ancestors, bat prototypes must have looked like. There is also an honourable tradition of inventing proto-pterosaurs. Here at far left, we've got Rupert Wildt's Proto-Pterosaurus, illustrated by Peter Wellenhofer, and this version has been re-illustrated by Mark Whitten. We've also got Mark Whitten's hypothetical pterosaur ancestors in the middle and at bottom right. And at top right, we've got Dave Hone's Proto-Pterosaur, the Technicolor Lewis Ray version. Then there are those hypothetical proto-birds, the most famous of them being Gerard Heilmann's Proavis of 1916, but that's far from the only one. Authors including Pycraft, Beebe, Ostrom, Paul, and others, Notcher, they have all come up with their own hypothetical bird ancestor, their own ideas of what a hypothetical bird ancestor should look like. Then there are the speculative protohumans, hypothetical primates that have been invented as imagined ancestors of the human species that were known to science at the time. Then there are hypothetical proto-turtles, hypothetical proto-snakes, hypothetical proto-mollusks, and so on and on and on. Most recently, a team of paleomammalogists, led by Maureen O'Leary, they analysed the placental mammal fossil record in an effort to reconstruct the group's most recent common ancestor. Here it is. This is a hypothetical but empirically plausible mammal that perhaps awaits discovery in the fossil record. Now, the speculative animals that I've just discussed, they all fit into mainstream evolutionary hypotheses, but there are numerous non-mainstream evolutionary hypotheses which, if taken seriously, require the creation of a whole new set of missing links. And let's look at one of my favourite examples. During the 1920s, Max Westenhofer and Serge Freshkop argued that the bipedal human body shape is the ancestral body shape for all primates, and they also argued that this body shape initially evolved within an aquatic context. These two ideas, that the human body shape is primitive and that it evolved in water, this was later expanded by ichthyologist Francois de Sar, who now argued that all mammals, and in fact all vertebrates, evolved from aquatic human-shaped ancestors. This is known as the initial bipedalism hypothesis. There is no support for this view from the fossil record, so de Sar has invented a whole sequence, a marvellous sequence of hypothetical ancestral and intermediate taxa forms that bridge the gaps between hypothetical ancestral aquatic early vertebrates and the members of later groups. So, does the creation of these alleged missing links fit within the speculative zoology remit? And basically I've come to the conclusion that, well, actually, no, they don't. This is not comparable with this. And that's because the fictional speculative animal is a thought experiment invented for fun. It may have logic and rationale behind it, but it doesn't represent an animal that we can ever see or discover. Its existence is non-testable. Conversely, all those hypothetical missing links or prototypes that I mentioned, they all involve specific predictions about evolutionary history. They make specific predictions about anatomy and lifestyle, and as such, their existence is testable. They are not just flights of fancy. Now, okay, some of those imaginary organisms, like the aquatic protohumans of the initial bipedalism hypothesis, those animals we can be confident that they never existed because the hypotheses that require them ultimately are erroneous. But we can't say the same for those hypothetical proto bats and proto snakes and proto placental mammals and so on. So far as we can tell at the moment, all those creatures really must have existed at some time. And this epiphany leads me to conclude that speculative zoology, as typically used, it has to relate specifically to the invention, to the pursuit of fictional entities. Now, an issue that's never really been discussed before concerns the function of speculative zoology. Does it serve any kind of useful purpose? And, well, should we expect it to? Well, as is demonstrated by the substantial interest it generates, speculative zoology is enormously entertaining. And it's the sheer entertainment value that does give it a function. Many of us are inventing creatures, for our own amusement and that of others, enjoyment, amusement, whatever. And some of us are lucky enough or clever enough to even be able to exploit this as a source of income. It's well known that numerous movies, TV shows, books, graphic novels, games, and so on, they feature speculative creatures that haven't just been invented out of thin air. Logic and thought and scientific assessment went into their design. The several speculative zoology projects that have been turned into TV shows or movies have generally been lucrative, sometimes very lucrative. Even After Earth, widely hailed a terrible movie and a financial megaflop, ended up grossing over $240 million, meaning that even this movie wasn't, technically a flop at all. When we consider that Avatar grossed over $2.8 billion, a good argument can be made that speculative zoology, when marketed in the right way, is big business and part of an insanely lucrative global economic force. And I would also say that the success of some of these projects demonstrates that an interest in speculative zoology is mainstream and near ubiquitous. So to people who say or imply that speculative zoology is some kind of weird niche interest, a fringe interest, no, it has global appeal across vast swathes of humanity, and it annually nets certainly millions of dollars. Which is why I'm so rich. What about and as is everyone else who has ever invented speculative animals. So, what about the scientific value of speculative zoology? Well, an argument can be made that by imagining things that have never happened, we can better understand or appreciate the kinds of things that did happen. So, imaginary scenarios whereby, for example, giant lizards rule the world, this is all very fun, But it leaves us asking as to whether such scenarios are really plausible. And if they're not plausible, why are they not plausible? Now, there have been occasional musings about such questions in the literature, but it's really difficult to know whether speculating about alternative evolutionary trajectories can ever really be done, in the rigorous scientific sense. I mean, after all, we can only ever study those things that have happened. But in the end, I would say there's nothing wrong with admitting that the bulk of speculative zoology really doesn't have any genuine value. It doesn't really serve any, especially useful purpose. Most of it represents artistic and intellectual expression of the sort that is a fundamental part of the human condition. People have always wanted to create images of things. They've always wanted to create images of creatures. And again, I'll make the point that this is an ancient attribute of our species. Someone like an evolutionary psychologist could have a field day speculating about what this actually might mean with regard to, how we see ourselves with respect to the rest of nature. So to basically summarise everything I've said, speculative animals of the future and speculative animals of alternative timelines, they form part of speculative zoology, but there's substantial overlap with fictional animals of all sorts, and also with aliens. Speculative zoology probably began with H.G. Wells in 1895. It's become increasingly popular and mainstream over time, and it contributes to the Hollywood machine today. Speculative zoology might be considered a descendant of monster building, the roots of which extend into prehistory, and which remains alive through the invention and investigation of cryptids. And cryptozoology overlaps extensively with speculative zoology. While hypothetical animals created as missing links are obviously speculative, their existence is testable, and hence they do not belong to the same subject area as the true denizens of speculative zoology, where creatures are wholly fictional. Finally, the invention of hypothetical animals may or may not have a function. Speculative zoology can shape questions about alternative evolutionary possibilities, but it might best be ultimately considered merely entertaining and part of our desire to indulge in monster building. There's a large number of people who provided advice and discussion and who allowed me to use their pictures. And thank you very much for being here today. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.